Hi, my name is Alex, and welcome to the Catholic Disciple, where we take some time to reflect on the work of God in us and our efforts to follow Him and love our neighbor. Today, I want to talk to you about how to discern your vocation. But before we get into the main topic, I wanted to share a little bit about my own story of discerning my vocation and give you a little insight into what it was like for me. So for a large portion of my life when I was growing up, I think I essentially assumed I was going to get married. However, once I got into college and I started following the Lord more seriously, the thought of priesthood eventually came to my mind, and I thought I should spend some time discerning this. It seemed like something that I was drawn to, so I started to think and pray about the priesthood. And eventually, I also started to think about religious life. More particularly, I was discerning the Carmelites. And long story short, I actually did end up joining the Carmelites. I was a Carmelite brother for almost 4 years. And during that time, I was also studying and preparing to become a priest. However, I felt the Lord was calling me somewhere else. It seemed like that was not my final stop on the journey, so to speak. So I ended up leaving the Carmelites. And again, long story short, after leaving the monastery, I started dating someone, and then we began thinking about marriage. And so we did end up eventually getting married. We now have 2 kids with 1 on the way, or depending on when this video finally launches, perhaps 3 already. So that's a bit about where I've been. I've kind of been all over the map as far as discerning a vocation goes. I've tried it all, so to speak, considered all of these different paths for my life, and eventually the Lord gave me some clarity and direction and pushed me in one particular path, which for me turned out to be marriage. So how do you figure out where the Lord is calling you? How do you discern that vocation? How do you see what the Lord wants for you? How do you discover where you will be most fulfilled in life and be best able to serve Him? So the first thing I want to talk about is a little bit about vocation in general. Vocation essentially is a calling. And for us Christians, a vocation is a calling from God to do a particular thing. And the primary call, the first call, the call that is given to all of us as Christians, is the call to holiness. What this essentially means is that every person, no matter what their state in life, is called to the fullness of the life that God wants to share with us. He wants to give all of us a share in His divine life and eventually join Him in His kingdom in heaven. And He wants to start giving us this gift of heaven here on this earth. And that's essentially what holiness is. It's heaven on earth. Holiness is closeness with God. Holiness is virtue. Holiness is union with God. There's a line from the letter of St. Peter where he says, "As He who called you is holy, be holy yourselves in all your conduct, since it is written, 'You shall be holy, for I am holy.'" And in Matthew chapter 5:45, he writes, "You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." All of us who follow Christ have this calling, have this mission, to be holy as the Father is holy, to grow in union with Him, to be His disciples. All of us have this calling to the fullness of love. Love for ourselves, love for our neighbor, and love for God. One element of living a holy life of love is the gift of self. There's a beautiful line from one of the documents from Vatican II, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, that says the following: "Man can fully discover his true self only in a sincere giving of himself." We can find ourselves only by giving ourselves away. And that leads into what we can think of as these particular vocations, the particular paths the Lord wants to use to bring us to holiness. All of these particular vocations are different ways to give ourselves away in love to God and to our fellow brothers and sisters. And so that's where we get what we generally think of as these vocations of marriage, priesthood, religious life, and dedicated single life. I'm not going to give a full description of all of these ways of life in this video. What I will do is I will offer a brief summary, and I will put some links in the description on where you can find a more comprehensive view of these different vocations. First, to say a couple words on marriage. I think most of us are generally familiar with marriage, but for the Christian, it's important to realize that married life is a true, full calling from God in its own right. It's not just the default path or the thing to do if God doesn't give you a special vocation. Marriage is a vocation. Marriage is a calling. It is something He calls men and women to so that they might build their own holy family on this earth, so that they might act as leaven in the world, so that they might bring God's light to worldly affairs and spread His kingdom all over. And so if you feel called to married life, don't think that that is just the boring vocation or the normal vocation or the ordinary vocation. Marriage is a very beautiful thing, and a married life lived well, a married life where both spouses are striving for holiness and raising their children to be disciples of Christ, is a powerful, beautiful thing. One of the other primary vocations is the priesthood. God calls men to be priests so that they can feed His sheep, primarily at the local level, at the local church. Priests feed His sheep by offering the sacraments, by teaching and preaching, and assisting in the running of the local church so that the people of God have a place to worship, a place to visit, a place to find instruction in the Christian way. They offer the sacrifice of the Mass and are in a special, unique way Christ's representatives here on earth. The other primary vocation that people are called to is religious life. Both men and women are called to religious life, to be brothers and sisters. Religious life, or as it is sometimes called consecrated life, is a special offering of self to God. It is a wholehearted gift. The person drawn to religious life wants to give God everything in a very extreme, radical way. They want to drop everything and follow Christ wherever He may go. They want to share in His mission, and they want to live a life free of distraction from worldly things, so that they may be fully dedicated to the work of God. Religious generally take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and they use those vows to help shape their life, give it some context and some rules, some boundaries, and essentially use those vows not to restrict their life, but to give them a greater freedom in the service of God. We also talk about this vocation to dedicated single life. This is a life where the person feels called not to be married, not to be a priest, not to be a religious in an established religious organization, but to live a life dedicated to God in a way that they couldn't be if they were married. Dedicated single life is not something that is seen very commonly. A way I've heard it described is that dedicated single life is not something you should necessarily go discern in its own right. It's more of something that may rise to the surface if you have been considering other vocations, like marriage or priesthood or religious life, and none of those seem to fit. There are probably exceptions to that rule, but I think it's probably a good place to start. The primary three vocations, marriage, priesthood, and religious life, are where most people will end up. And that's where I would recommend you start too, if you are trying to discern your vocation, your calling from the Lord for your life. So, now that we know a little bit about vocations in general, let's talk about discernment. If you're unfamiliar with the term, discernment in the Christian life is essentially listening for the Father's voice, listening for the Father's guidance, attempting to understand how He is moving in your life, and then taking this knowledge that you have learned and applying it to a particular decision in your life. You can discern big things like a vocation, like this primary path that your life is going to follow, but discernment also applies to little things, discerning what job to take, where to go to school, whether you should go on a trip, or how to spend your money. All of these things can be discerned, so to speak. Because at the end of the day, discernment is really just about listening for the Father's voice and striving to act based on the wisdom that you receive from Him. But in this context, we are thinking about discernment as listening for the Father's guidance on where He wants your life to go, the primary path He wants your life to take. I think it's also worth noting at this moment that it's not just a question of, well, God said I should do this thing arbitrarily, so I'll do it. I think a better way to think about vocation and God's calling for your life is, this is the way that He believes, He knows you will be most satisfied in life. You will be best able to serve Him. You will be best able to serve His people, to share His love with the world. The place where you will be most capable of receiving His love and His healing, so that you can be transformed into a saint, into a holy person, into a child of God. That's why I think it's good to think about vocation as seeking the Father's guidance. He knows us better than we know ourselves. He knows what's best for us. He knows where He can best work with us and lead us to Himself. And so we should be eager to get His advice, to hear where He wants us to go, because that's ultimately going to be what's best for us. The first thing I think that's important to discerning a vocation is to have some exposure to the different vocations out there. I mentioned the big ways earlier on, but it's important to expand on your understanding of those ways of life. Don't discount a vocation just because you don't know much about it. And if you feel a tug in a particular direction, for example, if you're a young man out there feeling a tug toward the priesthood, but you don't really know much about it, explore it. Talk to someone about the priesthood. Seek out your diocese vocation director and tell him, hey, I'm interested. I'd like to learn more. It doesn't mean you need to sign up and sign your life away tomorrow, but you can talk to them and get more information. God certainly wants to work with you and to help you understand, but sometimes He needs us to just learn some things on a human level too, to understand what a particular way of life looks like. If you think religious life sounds interesting, there are videos out there where you can watch a day in the life of a religious brother or sister and see what it's actually like. Sometimes the Father just needs us to have a bit more information so that He can speak to it and help us see what's best for us. Another thought in this area is to reflect on the works of mercy. Reflecting on the works of mercy can give you ideas on the different ways that you can serve God in this life, whether that's feeding the hungry or visiting the sick or the imprisoned or teaching the ignorant or comforting the sorrowful, whatever it may be. Sometimes it's just useful to broaden our horizons and understand what's out there. Another thing that I think is important to consider when discerning a vocation, in the words of St. Teresa of Avila, she writes, "It is important to understand that God does not lead all by one path. Your journey to discover your vocation will be unique. There's not a one-size-fits-all formula I can give you. Realizing that God leads us all along different paths is also helpful to remain at peace whenever you observe other people's discernment journeys. Some people find their answers very quickly, and others it takes a long time, and it's just usually not helpful for us to do too much comparison. The more we try to compare our journey to someone else's, the more we might get confused or frustrated or wonder why this person figured out their vocation after only 3 months of searching, and I've been at it for 2 or 3 years and I still don't know where to go with my life. It's going to look different for everyone, and that's okay. Take a deep breath and be at peace. If you keep seeking the Father, He will eventually reveal His will to you for your life. Another important thing to understand about discernment is that God is ultimately our master and guide in this process. In the words of St. John of the Cross, God is the master and guide of the soul. It can certainly be useful to receive some counsel, some recommendations, and some feedback from other people on your vocation journey. But at the end of the day, the more important part is to listen for the promptings of the Holy Spirit. The Father is ultimately the primary guide of your soul, of your life. And that essentially leads me into the next point, is the importance of prayer if you want to discern your vocation. I really encourage you, if you're actively trying to discern your vocation, where the Lord wants you to go in life, to make sure you have a habit of daily prayer. On that note, I have another video on this channel about the importance of daily prayer for the disciple of Jesus. I'll put the link in the description. Perhaps you may also find that useful. As I mentioned earlier, the primary call from the Father for our lives is the call to holiness, the call to union with Him. And these particular vocations are the means He wants to use to bring us to Himself. And so if the most important part of the Father's calling for our life is holiness, is a relationship with Him, we need to start there. We need to make sure that we are fostering a life of prayer, that we are striving to be holy people. We are studying His Word, and we are trying to grow in virtue. As I mentioned earlier, discernment is largely about listening for the Lord's voice. And that's essentially what prayer is about too. Prayer is perhaps more broadly a conversation with God, but a large portion of prayer is listening. We can grow in our ability to hear and understand the Lord's voice in our life. And praying regularly is one of the most important things to do if you want to better learn how to listen for the Father's voice. If you feel stuck in your discernment, if you're not really sure where to go, or you feel like you're not getting answers, perhaps what you may want to do is actually pause this discernment process and just spend some time getting to know the Lord. Try to spend extra time in prayer. Perhaps find a new way to serve Him. Make your focus loving and serving the Lord, growing in relationship with Him, and then revisit the discernment piece. Perhaps it just wasn't time yet. Perhaps He wanted you to work on yourself first before you turned to the question of, how am I going to serve the world with my life? A strong relationship with the Lord is essential if you want to discern your vocation. And if you feel like you're not getting answers, perhaps the best thing to do is pause and spend some extra time getting to know the Lord. This essentially leads me into my next point too, that discernment is ultimately a lifelong journey of discovering the Father's will for your life. It's not just an isolated question of, well, do I take path A, B, or C? That's certainly part of it, but really what He's looking for is relationship with you. He wants to be with you, He wants to be a part of your life, and He wants to help you respond to His promptings. And so you'll spend the rest of your life discerning the Father's will. Sometimes it comes in the context of these big questions of which vocational path do I follow. Beyond that, there will be plenty of other things to discern in your life. It's important to realize that you may not get the answers to this question in a day. It might take some time. The overall path of your life, your primary vocation, so to speak, is a big thing. And it's a big part of how you're going to love and serve the Lord for the rest of your life. The Father is usually more patient than we are. He is content to allow us to sit with some of these things for a while and let them simmer as we grow in relationship with Him. And our primary vocation is just another piece of this relationship with the Father and with His people. It's an important one, but it is still just a piece, and our relationship with the Lord spans a lifetime. Be at peace knowing that your discernment of your primary vocation is probably not going to happen as quickly as you would like, but don't allow that to discourage you. Turn your focus to the Father. Strive to love Him as best you can, and He will reveal His will to you. Another important part of discernment is to acknowledge and understand that discernment is not a math problem. It's not a question of figuring out the right variables, putting them in the equation, pushing the button, and getting the answer out on the other side. As I mentioned earlier, discernment is about listening to the Father's voice. He's your Father. He wants to speak to you and talk to you and have a relationship with you. This is not a contractual relationship. This is a relationship between parent and child, father and son, father and daughter. And we are not going to be able to squeeze answers out of him like a slot machine. Discerning your vocation is about receiving guidance and wisdom from the Father on where you can best serve his people, on where you can best grow in love and holiness, and grow in relationship with him. Discernment is the fruit of a strong relationship with the Father, not a prize at the end of a puzzle. I know I have done this in the past when attempting to discern my vocation at different points in life, especially if you've been in it for a while and are really struggling to find your answer, so to speak. It's very easy for the discernment process to turn very mechanical and contrived, and you spend all of this time hunting for concrete pieces of evidence in your life that say, well, the answer is X. And a lot of times that's just not the way the Lord works. A mechanical discernment process takes all of the faith, hope, and love out of it. It takes the relationship out of it. The Lord does want to reveal his will for your life, but he's probably not going to write it in the clouds, and it's probably not something that you will be able to see beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's always going to take an amount of faith. And a final thought on this question of discernment is to understand that God always leads us through peace, never through fear. There's a line from St. Teresa of Avila on this point. She writes, "And so I would never counsel anyone to fail out of fear to put a good inspiration into practice when it repeatedly arises." So if you find yourself considering a particular vocation and you notice that there is an abnormal amount of fear in your heart over considering this path, let's say, for example, there's a man thinking about being a priest, and every time he thinks of it, there's this wave of fear that comes into his heart. Perhaps there's a fear of giving up marriage, or a fear of losing his freedom. Generally, these are not from God. God wants to lead us through peace. In Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 5, verse 23, he refers to God as the God of peace. This is generally how the Lord wants to lead us. And so when we see peace come up in part of our discernment process, that's generally a good sign that the Lord is encouraging you to go down that direction, or at least explore that further. And if we see fear come up in a part of our discernment, it's important to defend against that, to not allow ourselves to be swayed out of fear, to turn away from something the Lord may want us to do. Fear can be a strong emotion, but the Lord wants to overcome that. And so if you find yourself hitting up against fear when considering a specific vocation, pray for the Lord's guidance, pray for his peace to show you the path he wants you to follow, and pray for the strength to resist the fear that comes from the evil one. From here, I'd like to offer a few practical tips on discerning your vocation. The first of which is to focus on discerning the things you actually have direct control over. When you start discerning your vocation, it's easy to get a little lost in the weeds, to start asking big questions like, does the Lord want me to be a priest? Does the Lord want me to get married? Does the Lord want me to be a religious brother or sister? And to avoid being overwhelmed, it's good to break it down into pieces. So instead of saying, does the Lord want me to be a priest? Ask the question, does the Lord want me to talk to my bishop about being a priest? Does the Lord want me to go visit a seminary where priests study? and see what that's like. If you're thinking about marriage, not a question of, well, I've never talked to this person before, but does the Lord want me to marry that woman, that man? Maybe ask, does the Lord want me to go on a date with them or ask them out? Focus on discerning the next step that is in your control. I think the Lord tends to only give us the light we need to take the next right step. The next right step is something manageable. Jesus says in the scriptures, sufficient for a day is its own evils. It's good to break it down into what I can actually do today. Sometimes we just want the Lord to give us the whole map so we know exactly where to go. We know the final destination. I know all the steps I need to take, and then I'm just going to go do it. I think there are a few problems with that. If the Lord actually did give us the full map right up front, would we actually do it? Or would we perhaps be discouraged? Would we go down the path of fear or cowardice? If we actually saw all the twists and turns our path will take, would we still want to go down that road? Giving us only enough light for the next step helps strengthen our faith, because we need to trust the Father, knowing that if I take this next step, attempting to follow Him, He will continue to lead me beyond here. Perhaps it's best if we don't know the full story. This leaves room for us to trust the Father, and it also leaves room for Him to surprise us. Another practical tip is to make your discernment process concrete. And what I mean by that is the Lord's call for our life is going to be very particular. To marry a particular person, to join a particular religious community. And it's hard to discover that just by thinking about it in your head and researching it. If you're considering marriage as your vocation, you need to go date to find someone who is compatible with you, someone that the Lord may be calling you to love in the sacrament of marriage. If you're considering religious life, you should reach out to a particular community. See if you can go visit them, talk to them, get more information. At the end of the day, you're not going to find your vocation by researching it on the internet. If you've reached a point in your discernment process where you feel stuck, perhaps part of the answer may be to take another concrete step. Perhaps up to this point your discernment process has been too nebulous, too much in your own head. Another practical tip in discerning your vocation is to entrust a certain saint with praying for your vocation. I know for my wife and I, we entrusted our discernment of marriage to Saint Teresa. We prayed to her, we prayed novenas to Saint Teresa that she might help us understand whether the Lord was calling us to marriage. And we definitely believe that we received her help. So if you have a favorite saint that you would like to pray to for guidance in your vocation, or perhaps there is a saint that is closely associated with the type of life you're considering. For example, if you're discerning whether to be a Dominican, find a Dominican saint to pray to for guidance. And another interesting practical tip that may work for some, may not work for others, is to ask yourself some hypothetical questions. Questions like, if I were on my deathbed and I had to look back at my life, would I regret not picking a particular vocation? Or something like, if I only had a year left to live and I had to choose a particular vocation to spend that year, where would I want to spend that time serving the Lord? If you find that those questions are not helpful to you, just ignore them. I don't think they're necessary, but it's another way to look at the situation from a different angle, and it may reveal something to you that you had not otherwise thought. In summary, I want to underline one final point: the importance of faith in the discernment journey. You can do all the searching and reading and praying you want, but at the end of the day, you actually have to step out in faith and try something. If you're thinking of joining a religious community, the next step for you may be to step out in faith and join that community and start initial formation. God will never forsake you if you start walking down the wrong path. In all of these vocations, there are many smaller steps you take first before you make that one big final commitment at the end. And up until you reach that point, the Lord can redirect you. He can work with you, and He will work to redirect you if you start walking down the path that is not best for you. But He will never move your feet without your consent. There's an interesting quote from St. John of the Cross that I think is relevant on this point. He writes, "For though faith brings certitude to the intellect, it does not produce clarity, but only darkness. For though faith brings certitude to the intellect, it does not produce clarity, but only darkness." And as far as I understand that, what that tells me is that it's possible to have certainty in faith about a thing. In our example, certainty about the vocation the Lord is calling you to. It's possible to have that certainty, but perhaps not have clarity on how all the pieces fit together. I think a lot of the time when we want certainty about God's will for our life, certainty about a situation, we also want clarity with it. We want to see how all of the pieces fit together. But again, that leaves little room for trust. If God gives us all the pieces and says, well, here's how everything's going to go. You're going to go join this religious community and you're going to stay there for 2.5 years, and then you're going to have a crisis in faith and leave, and then you're going to go do this and that, and that's how you're going to come to me. If He gave us all of that information at the beginning, what reason would there be to trust Him? What reason would there be for faith? Remember, this is about a relationship. It's about a relationship with the Father. He's inviting us in, and in order for us to grow, we need to grow in trust. We need to grow in faith. We need to believe in the Father and His promises and His desire to do good things for us. We may never have all the pieces. We may never have the map fully drawn in our hands beforehand, but that should not stop us from stepping out on a ledge in faith, jumping and allowing the Father to catch us. If we are striving to please Him and to follow Him and understand His will for our lives as best as we can, and we take a wrong step, He's not going to punish us for not understanding His word clearly. We might fail. We might get it wrong. In my own example, I followed the Lord's call into religious life. I was a Carmelite brother for almost 4 years. And all throughout that time, I had some doubts that gradually built up into me understanding the Lord was calling me elsewhere. And so I had to make what was perhaps one of the most difficult decisions of my life, to leave the monastery. And at many times it felt like failing. It felt like disappointing the people around me. But I can assure you, from the other side of that ledge, the Lord has been with me. The Lord has brought many blessings to my life and continues to bring me good things. And I know for certain that my time as a Carmelite brother was a time full of blessings and graces. I believe in faith that the Lord was pleased with the sacrifice I made, entering the monastery, living as a Carmelite brother, trying to understand His will. He brought me into the monastery for a period of time and then called me out. And I truly believe He has blessed me abundantly for my efforts to follow Him, to follow and respond to His call for my life. And so that is the word I'd like to leave you with today. Trust. Discernment is primarily about trust. Trust in the Father, trust in His desire to reveal His will to us, trust in His ability to help us understand His call, hear His voice, and trust that the Father will catch us no matter what happens. So I encourage you, take time for prayer every day. Do your best to follow the Lord, to strive to be a good disciple, to receive the gifts the Lord wants to give you. Make your best effort to understand where He's calling you to go. And when you think you have enough light, take that step out in faith, trusting that the Father will bless you whenever you strive to please Him and serve Him and love Him. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. Listen for the Father's voice and follow His call. God bless you.